Hello again, and welcome back to your weekly dose of the Coastal Football Agency podcast, Ep.4. For the show today, we have a very special guest, the native Mancunian, author, drummer, football evangelist, and the best football commentator and journalist in the country. It's Simon Hill. Simon, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you, Daniel. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. Obviously, we were just speaking about it before, but you're obviously in a little bit of a difficult situation there in the inner west in Sydney at the moment. Simon, how are you coping with everything?
Yeah, well, it could be better. Obviously, we're in lockdown, have been for the best part of 2 weeks, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon, unfortunately. But, we're not the first part of the country to go through this, not the first part of the world to go through this. And by and large, we've had it relatively easy over the last 18 months, 2 years. So we just got to, buckle down and get on with it, unfortunately, and try and get through this and hope that the numbers drop sooner rather than later. But yeah, it's pretty depressing, particularly in the winter. Where in Sydney we've had rain solid for the last 3 days, so you end up not getting out of the house, which is it's pretty depressing. But anyway.
Something on a brighter note that must be keeping you happy is obviously England at the moment. Now, it would be absolute criminal for us not to talk about the Euro, Simon. I want to get a little bit of a prediction from you. Obviously, it is a Euro 2020 edition podcast as well. So to have you on our final episode is a fantastic way to cap it off. But tell me, in regards to 5 a.m. later this morning, what are you thinking?
I honestly don't know. I think it's a 50-50 proposition, to be honest. I think if it was being played on neutral territory, I'd probably be saying Italy are the slight favourites because I think they've had a terrific tournament and they've got quality, right the way throughout their ranks. And the goalkeeper Donnarumma, the two central defenders who are just, absolute rocks at the back, Bonucci and Chiellini, Jorginho in midfield, Immobile, and Insigne up front. They're a terrific side all round, very well coached on a long unbeaten record, 33 matches. So, with that in mind, you'd probably say Italy would be the slight favourites. But I think home advantage is big, particularly in a major final. And England will have 65,000 people, cheering them on. And obviously they're familiar conditions for England, more familiar than they are for Italy anyway. So I think that sort of squares it up. And yeah, I honestly don't know who's going to win. Obviously as an Englishman, I hope it's going to be England. But for us, I'm just delighted that we finally got to a final. We've had to wait an awful long time for that. So I think Gareth Southgate is building something quite special with England. And if they don't win the Euros this time, I certainly think they will be contenders at the World Cup in Qatar in 2022.
He really represents a 21st century international manager, doesn't he, Gareth Southgate?
He does. I've just noticed you've got your England top on. Very impressed. Yeah, he's the epitome of sort of the modern thinking manager, I think, of which, we haven't had too many in my part of the world in the recent past. The English traditional stereotype of the English manager is very much the 4-4-2 up and atom type coach. And Southgate is very, very different to that. He, is flexible with his tactics. He's modest in his outlook, although he did say something the other day which rather irritated me about the Germans invading us, which was rather frustrating to read. But, by and large, he's respectful and flexible. He's very much the modern manager, which I think England needed, to be honest. And, what they've done over the last sort of best part of a decade with the FA is that they've put a system in place to develop a prototype of an England player. And I think we're starting to see the rewards of that now. A lot of this team are very young and they've been through the system. They've won things. England under 17 won the Junior World Cup. England under 20 won the Junior World Cup and European Championships besides. And they all play the same way through the junior ranks until they get to the senior team. And that's something that England didn't have for an awful long time. It was very haphazard, very ad hoc, and a lot of those junior players never went on to represent the full national side. that's changed. So there's very much more of a community feel and of an England DNA, if that's the right term for it. And I think that's fantastic. Certainly as an Englishman, I've enjoyed watching them at this tournament. I don't think they're the finished product, to be honest. I think there's one or two little weaknesses in the team, but overall, they've done very, very well. Surprised me, to be honest, to get this far. I didn't think they'd reach the final. Obviously, now I hope they can go on and win it.
Mm. Well, yes, an absolute cracking final awaits us, and it will be an absolute joyous occasion. Hopefully, for the English back home. Um, is football coming home, or is it going Rome? We'll find out soon. But look, before I take a little bit of a delve back into the past, Simon, and go right the way through, I want to focus on big events that have happened basically in the last 4 to 6 weeks. Firstly, if I've read this correctly, it is a return for you back behind the microphone this year in 2021. And a new TV broadcast deal was announced by the APL chairman, in which Paramount Plus will take over the reins from Fox Sports in a $200 million deal that sees one game per week featured across Channel 9 with the W League and the A League. Is this a step in the right direction, do you think?
First of all, it's Channel 10, not Channel 9. Um, secondly, just to correct you on my return to the microphone, yeah, everybody seems to think that I've signed a contract and it's a done deal. It's not happened yet.
Mm.
Now, that's obviously I'd like to be a part of it, but that's something to be decided in the future. With regards to the deal itself, yeah, look, I think it's an exciting future and prospect for the game. I think it's a fresh start. I think the game probably needed that. Obviously, there's financial investment there, and I hear that they're potentially about to get private investment to top that up as well. I hear Danny Townsend talking the other day about the construction of this football hub and a one-stop shop for all your football content online, which again they've flagged up for quite some time now. That's an exciting development, and it looks as though football is moving into a different era. So, look, I hope it's going to be very successful. I trust it's going to be, and yeah, can't wait. Bring it on.
Excellent, excellent. So now going back into where everything started for you, Simon, I want to take you back to a time in August 1984 on a mild summer's day in Castle Ashby, Northamptonshire, planted behind the drum kit on the main stage, performing in front of 3,000 people at the Green Belt Festival. And how does that feeling of emotion compared to calling Tim Cahill's 84th minute strike to level the score with Japan in Kaiserslautern 22 years later on a boiling hot summer's day at the 2006 FIFA World
That's a
Cup?
very good question. I like that. Yeah, they're obviously very different, but both a big thrill in their own rights. I've got two great passions in my life. Well, it's probably a bit more than that, but certainly these are the two that are standouts. Obviously, football is one, which is my job and one of my great loves in life. The other is music, and for a little while, when I was a teenager, not very long to be honest, but for a little while, that's what I wanted to do with my life. And before I probably realised that I wasn't quite good enough. Yeah, that day in 1984, I was playing with a band with my schoolmates, who I'm still in touch with today, still making music with
Mm.
today, actually, in the UK. A band called Eye to Eye. And we were invited to play the Greenbelt Rock Festival, which I don't know if it still is, but it certainly was a big one of the big festivals in the UK. We were on the fringe stage, it must be said, not the main stage. There were two fringe stages.
I thought you were on.
Yeah. I think the Alarm were playing on the main stage, and we didn't get near them. But even so, it was a big thrill. We played on the fringe stage, and there were probably about 3,000 people watching, which, for us who were used to playing in pubs in front of about 50 people, that was a big thing. And we opened up, I remember, with a cover song, which we weren't supposed to do. Covers weren't allowed, but we snuck this one in,
Mm.
which was
Mm.
U2's Sunday Bloody Sunday.
Oh.
And of course, if you know that tune, you'll know that it starts off with the drums.
Mm,
So that was me, obviously. So
mm,
I remember, when I was hitting the first beats on it, thinking, "Wow, this is something special," because it was just me, and obviously the drums were mic'd up, and it was echoing around this arena. So yeah, it was pretty special. I loved it.
absolutely.
Unfortunately, I then went off to university, and so did all the others, and we ended up splitting up, and it didn't work. But yeah, they're nice memories, and in terms of the football, obviously that's something completely different, and it was a very special day as well. But yeah, 1984, Castle Ashby. Goodness me, that was a long time ago. Before I had grey hair.
Mm. Now, the Greenbelt Festival, though, is no ordinary music festival, Simon. As you know,
Mm,
Greenbelt is also a venue for teaching and discussion about the Christian
that's
faith.
right.
Did
Yeah.
you grow up in a strong Christian household? And what values and belief were instilled with you at a young age?
I did. And to be honest, again, I can say this now 30, 40 years later. I think we had to sign some sort of a waiver to say that we were Christians. Now, that might have been a little bit of a white
Mm,
lie, to be honest.
mm,
Even though I grew up in a Church of England household and, Sunday school every Sunday, going to church every Sunday when I got a bit older. I can't say that I'm hugely religious, to be honest. Whether it instilled some values in me, yeah, look, I'm pretty sure it did. But I think they're humanist values of, respect, tolerance, all the nice things that we'd like to say about our characters. Whether I live up to those on a day by day basis, I don't know. The same as everybody else. Um, but yeah, I can't say that I'm religious or ever have been really. I think it was just that as a kid, obviously you have to do what your parents tell you, and that's what I had to do every Sunday. But yeah, I can't remember the last time I was in a church. That's for sure.
mm. When asked to describe Manchester, the city, legendary Rolling Stones musician Gary Manny Moonfield said, "It's like a pirate ship full of scurvy dogs, vagabonds, and near do wells, and a couple of half decent football teams every hour and then." How do you respond to this assessment?
Yeah, that's probably near to the mark. It certainly was. When I was growing up, there was yeah, there was gang warfare, and there was drugs, and there was crime. That was the nasty bit. The other side of it was that there was, I think a community that probably we don't see today, either in Manchester or many other places, to be honest. And I think that's just, um, the result of evolution, if you want to put it that way. And I don't say that that's positive evolution, because I think in many ways the fact that we're, all attached to these things, these mobile phones, 24 hours a day, I think has in one way made us more connected as a race, a human race. Um, but also made us more disconnected in the fact that we don't talk to each other, and obviously COVID isn't helping that at the moment either. So I think there were good and bad things about growing up in that part of the world. Obviously, it gave me, my love of football and music as well. Two things that are very central to Manchester. It's a city that doesn't get impressed by too many things. It has a very glass half empty approach to life, which I sort of quite like. It doesn't get carried away with stuff. It doesn't big itself up necessarily. It's quite self-deprecating.
Mm,
I would hope that I've got some of those values. So
classic, mate.
yeah, it's an interesting city, and a city with a lot of history as well. One of the homes of the Industrial Revolution, very strongly rooted in unionism and socialism to a large degree, and I class myself as both. So it's probably imprinted itself on me in quite a few ways, I would imagine, good and bad.
Mm. Or within northern working class communities, as you said, in which the importance of tribalism was
Mm,
deeply sewn within the fabrics of society, littered with an abundance of subcultures in which you already touched on there: politics, music, fashion, football. Um, an interesting quote that I found here is: "Football must never descend into violence, although it must always teeter on the brink." I'm
correct.
fascinated in hearing about your
Correct.
football experiences. Watching football on your own for the first time in the 80s, especially big away games, in which, Simon, you certainly must have to be on your toes back
Oh
then.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Tell me about those experiences on the terraces in the 80s.
I like that quote because that's exactly how I see it. In fact, I just had an exchange on Twitter today about that. Um, Somebody has written a piece about booing of national anthems and fans should lose if they misbehave. Well, booing of national anthems, and I don't agree with it. Incidentally, I don't condone it, but I recounted my experience at the Estadio Centenario in 2005 when Uruguay played Australia, and the Uruguayans booed the Australian anthem. They booed it so loud you could barely hear a bar of it, and they were hostile, but not threatening in the sense that you thought, "Blimey, I might not get out of here alive." It was just tribalism and passion. I loved it. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. And growing up watching football in the 70s and 80s as I did, I had that same sense of excitement and edge when I went to watch football on a Saturday, particularly away from home.
Mm.
In the 70s, when I first started going with my dad, obviously I was too young to go on my own, and I'd sit in the seats with my dad and my granddad. And that was still a thrill. But going away from home when I got older in the 80s, and this was right at the peak of the hooliganism epidemic, if you want to put it that way, in
Mm.
the UK. And sometimes it was a little bit scary, and you did see one or two things, but most of the time it was bravado. It was, making a bit of noise. It was having a few beers. It was being passionate about your team. And 9.5 times out of 10, that's where it stopped.
Mm.
If somebody had come up to me trying to pick a fight, I'd have run a mile. I wasn't interested in getting involved in that stuff. But you do all your posturing and you wearing your colours, and you're representing your town and your team.
Mm.
Um,
You weren't
but,
interested in the fight, though, Simon.
no, not in the slightest. Never had a fight at the football in my life, nor would I ever want one. And I went to thousands of games in the 80s and 90s, and sorry, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and beyond. And you know, I saw trouble on the odd occasion, but it was very easy for me to avoid because I didn't want to be part of it. So if there was stuff near me, I moved away. I wasn't interested in that at all. But the edginess of football was something that was very, very attractive to me, and I think to a younger generation because it's a little bit anarchic, within the framework of
Mm.
not breaking the law, obviously. So I think that's what gives football its edge for supporters. And I think we've lost a lot of that, certainly in the UK with the all-seater stadiums, with the gentrification of football. I think the atmosphere has suffered badly. I understand why they had to do it because some of that hooliganism had got out of hand. Here in Australia, we've used a sledgehammer to crush a nut. I mean, the problems here were minuscule, utterly minuscule. And yet people were scared to death of it because it was a bit different. That's our point of
Mm.
difference, that it's different. And that's great,
Mm.
so long as it doesn't, break the law. But most people don't.
Talk to me about fist fights, flick knives, and fiery football firms. That was a line crossed, though, wasn't it? Yeah, I
Yeah,
know
of
you
course it
touched on
was.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course it was. And they were sadly a part of football in the 80s, but people saw this as a football problem. Personally, I've always seen it as a societal problem, and football was the vehicle that they attached themselves to carry out their acts of violence, because a lot of them were hard right wing, um, British National Party, racist thugs, criminals, gangs, and football was such an easy vehicle for them because they could go to other towns and take on the other team's firms, as they were called, and have a good ruck. And I always despised the glorification of that, particularly which came in the 90s with, the Hooli Lit, Green Street Hooligans, and A Day in the Life of a Football Thug, and all that stuff. These guys made money out of being criminals, basically. That's not right. But football fans, genuine football fans, they didn't want those people. I didn't want them.
Mm.
I wasn't interested
Mm,
in that. For me, it was about the football, and you could sometimes tell who these guys were because they didn't wear collars. That's how non-football aligned they were. They were about wearing casual gear. Their Fred Perry tops and their Farah trousers. I'm talking about back in the 80s here.
yeah.
They had a very specific sense of dress as well. They were called the casuals. And they went out to cause trouble. They weren't there for the football. They didn't care about the football, most of them. So that it became a football problem. I mean, I understand why, because they were committing the acts of violence at football. But it was a societal problem that needed to be resolved. You always get fringe groups who attach themselves to things like this, and football was the most popular. So, yeah, it was unfortunate, but as I said, the amount of incidents I saw in the 80s, and I went to an awful lot of away games where we got treated pretty badly, to be honest. I went on the old football special trains where there were lines of police and horses. I got stamped on by a police horse and, pretty much treated as though we were all criminals, which wasn't right because most of us weren't. But that was the time, unfortunately. Now it is better these days in that regard, but I think we've also lost something in the process, and that's that atmosphere, that edge that football had in the 80s. And I think that's a pity.
Can we translate that to Australia, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, 4 or 5 years ago, if you remember, we were starting to build a sort of edginess, atmosphere, tribalism that I think football requires. Sydney derbies, Melbourne derbies, grand finals, big blues. That was. I remember doing a Sydney derby in the early days when it was massive, and the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on. I was like, wow, this is like the old days. Because there was a real sense of tribalism between the two sets of supporters, which was terrific. And unfortunately, we killed that by trying to appease the mainstream, who didn't understand it and thought we were all hooligans. Well, there were one or two bad eggs. Yeah, sure. Let the police do their job, sift them out, ban them from the grounds, throw them in prison if you need to, if they're misbehaving that badly. But don't tar the rest of the football population with the same brush. And that's what they did, unfortunately, and I think that's why a lot of fans, sadly, walked away.
Mm. Yeah, very well said, and we'll touch on that a little bit more later on as well. But more into your breakthrough into your professional career. You spoke in a previous interview about your awareness, and we were talking about this before. Jobs were at a premium, and by the time you graduated in 1991, the UK found itself in a recession. At what age did you realise that you had to leave Manchester to further your broadcasting career?
Well, look, to be honest, I'd already left Manchester anyway because I went to university in Portsmouth, which is down on the south coast, and didn't. I only returned briefly back home after I'd finished my studies because, like most students, I'd run up a bit of student debt
Mm.
and needed to pay that off. So I went back home. I think it was only for about 6 months. But I was always aware that my earning a living would probably not be in Manchester. I think in the UK, obviously the UK is a lot smaller than Australia, so people move around quite a lot to different towns, different cities, and I was more than happy to do that. To be honest, I mean, after living in Portsmouth, I quite enjoyed living in a different part of the country. So when I got my first breakthrough in the industry, which was with a radio station called Red Dragon in Cardiff in South Wales, that wasn't necessarily a big move for me because I'd already moved away from home, if you want to put it that way, when I was
Mm,
18 to go to
mm.
university. So it was sort of a natural step, and yeah, I enjoyed it. It was fun.
2 years after graduating, if I believe head of BBC Lancashire at the time, Guy Havett, gave you your first break in commentary by placing you in front of 29,000 at Stamford Bridge on the opening day of the 91-92 Premier League season between Chelsea and Blackburn Rovers.
It was 93, 94, actually. But
Yeah.
yes, you're right. You're right with the game. Guy and I had both been appointed at the same time for as the new sports team, along with a guy called Gary Hickson, who was already there for BBC Radio Lancashire. I've been with Red Dragon for about 18 months, 2 years. and I wanted to move to the BBC because that was the natural stepping stone for a lot of sports journalists at the time, into local radio with the BBC. So I got that job as basically as Guy's right hand man, number two. And between us, yeah, we started trying to change the sports output of the radio station, and on the first, it was a couple of weeks before the start of that new Premier League season, we were sort of divvying up the responsibilities and what we're going to do. And Guy said, well, first day of the season, it's Chelsea against Blackburn. Blackburn were our senior team, if you like. At the time, we had Burnley, Preston, and Blackpool as well, but they were lower down in the English pyramid at that particular stage. So Blackburn were just on the rise, of course, under Kenny Dalglish with Alan Shearer, and Robbie Slater was to come later, and Tim Flowers, Tim Sherwood, David Batty, all those players. So Guy said to me, first weekend of the season, so you go down to London and you call Chelsea against Blackburn. And I sort of gulped and said, I've not done commentary before. And he said, well, let's find out if you can do it. So it was a case of being thrown in at the deep end, really. This is radio commentary, obviously not TV. So off I went down to Stamford Bridge that first day of the season, August 1993, and yeah, that was my first full commentary, which most people start doing local league games or lower division games, and I got thrown in at Stamford Bridge for a Premier League match, but obviously I did all right because I've been doing it ever since.
What lessons did you have to learn very quickly in order to be successful in the industry?
That's a good question. I think hard work is the main one. Obviously, when you work in sport, and there are still people today who I know work in sport who do this, and I just find it baffling, to be honest. You got to be prepared to work weekends for a start, because that's when sport happens mainly. You got to be prepared to work overnights. You got to be prepared to work early shifts. Essentially, this is not a job; it's a lifestyle. And if you get something that you love to do for a living, then you have to dedicate yourself to it. It's like being a footballer. You got to live it 24/7, because there are thousands of other people who will gladly take your place. So you've got to be firmly dedicated to it. And fortunately for me, that came easy because, as I said, this is not just what I do for a living. It's pretty much who I am. I love football. I live it anyway. When I'm not working in it, I'm reading about it, watching it, writing about it. So that side of things came easy to me. So I think, yeah, certainly a lot of hard work and research in terms of your craft. You also need a little bit of luck. To get the breaks at the right time. Now, I've been really fortunate. I've had two or three big breaks in my career. The first one was getting that job at Red Dragon, in which I didn't actually apply for the sports reporting role. I applied for another job, didn't even know the sports reporting role was going, and they wrote back to me and said, "Look, I don't think you're suitable for this job, but would you be interested in having a crack for this one?" So that was a stroke of good fortune. And then again, coming to Australia in 2003, which was really thanks to a friend of mine who I knew from the BBC days, who'd emigrated out to Australia in the late 90s, and alerted me to a job over here, and pestered me so much that eventually I put a job application in. So there are certain sort of points in time in your career where they're almost sliding doors moments, and they work for you or they work against you. I mean, I've had some obviously down moments as well. Losing my job at Fox, I lost my job at ITV back in 2001 because the channel went bust. So you've got to be able to ride those ups and downs and be a little bit resilient as well. So I think they would be the three big lessons: hard work, a little bit of good fortune, and resilience when things don't go your way.
Excellent. Well summed up, Simon. Obviously, on the topic of commentary, you were quoted in an earlier interview in regard to calling at Main Road, saying that it was a nervous, odd feeling, and I felt out of my comfort zone. I belonged on the stands with my father.
That's right.
Now, calling at Main Road for you would think would be a joyous occasion. So, would you care to elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, again, here is where the journalist sort of crosses over with the fan, and I think if you're a sports journalist, if you're a football journalist in particular, if you've not had a team growing up, I would question why you want to be in football journalism, because that's where it all starts for me. You get a passion for a club, and therefore a passion for the game, and that sort of carries on into your working life. Now, if you don't have that, I don't see how you can empathize with your audience, because your audience are basically football fans. And for me, when I got that game to go and call it at Main Road, I felt awkward. There was something about that wasn't right, because I was crossing over into the other part of my life, which was being a Manchester City fan. I felt that I would always be open to accusations of bias when I was calling Manchester City, which is fair enough because they were my team. I've always been open about that, always. Um, and secondly, as I said, my place at that particular stadium, Main Road, was home to me. That was as much my home as where I lived, because I went there so often as a kid, but obviously never in the press box. I was always sat in the stands or on the terraces. So to be there in an official capacity, it didn't feel right. It was, if I can make this analogy, it was like going to church and putting the vicar's robes on and trying to take the service. You know, you might be familiar with the church, but the role wasn't yours.
Mm,
Your place was in the pews, listening. So yeah, it was an odd experience, and I have to say, not one that I enjoyed a whole amount. Now, these days, I mean, I've called Man City in recent times. I called them in the Champions League for Optus last year. Obviously, that was remotely off TV. And I felt it was a bit easy because being in Australia for nearly 2 decades, there's a little bit of a sense of detachment. Um, they'll always be my club. I'll always, be a Man City fan. But obviously, the time I've got a bit older, and the geographical separation means that it's a little bit easier. But in those days, I was still going, when I wasn't working, I was still going watching City whenever I could, because I was still, an active supporter on a week by week basis. So to try and change from that into being impartial observer, sat in a press box at a place that felt like a second home to me. Oh no, it was really strange. I didn't
mm,
like it.
interesting. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, very interesting, Simon. Like you said, many years after your debut at Stamford Bridge, you go on through Red Dragon, BBC, Sky, and you find yourself at ITV. And we know, due to a string of administrational errors, if that's how you want to call it,
That's a good
um,
way of putting it.
they went bust. Now we know they overestimated the value of what they were dishing out to the Premier League clubs in regards to finances. What
Championship clubs it was, yeah.
championship clubs? Sorry.
Yeah, it was championship
Um,
and down, yeah.
what key business lessons did you learn from that experience?
Um, I think it was, never to assume anything. When I signed for ITV, I actually had an offer to go and work for ESPN in Singapore around the
Mm,
same time.
mm,
And I'd actually verbally agreed that contract. I hadn't signed anything, but I'd verbally agreed it. And then ITV came in a couple of weeks later. Um, and the second lesson would be, don't always be swayed by money. And one of the reasons I signed, it wasn't the only reason I signed for ITV, but ITV offered me a very, very good package in terms of money, which was a lot more than what ESPN were offering me. And I discussed it, with a few people, including my parents, and you can't turn down that offer from ITV. That'll set you up, and in a few
mm,
years' time, you'll be doing this, that, and the other for ITV. And of course, I was looking long term, thinking 10, 15 years' time, I'll still be with ITV. Now, it didn't work out that way through no fault of my own. And within 12 months, I was unemployed. So that was, maybe, I'm not saying I should have gone to ESPN, because at the time I made that decision in good faith. And, ITV had a very good plan at the time as to what they were going to do. But it was, it was a salutary lesson that, that things don't always turn out the way that you expect them to. Um, and perhaps you should look a little bit deeper into what you're signing up to. But again, I think, even 20 years on, I'd have been tempted to have made the same decision, not just because of the money, but because at the time ITV were, promising a lot. They were looking to challenge Sky as the digital provider, and they had plans to acquire more rights. It just didn't work out because they didn't have a good business plan, basically. So yeah, in 2002, I was unemployed. I wasn't the only one, by the way. There's an awful lot of people made unemployed on the back of that. And I was fortunate because I was able to continue my career. Some didn't. Some weren't able to. They went into other professions. But what I did do, just to sort of maybe preempt your next question, when I was about to sign for SBS, I actually had an offer from Sky Sports in the UK. So again, I had two offers at the same time. And Sky, again, were offering me more money, and they were the preeminent broadcaster in the UK. And on that occasion, I said, no, I'm going to Australia, even
Mm,
for less money, because I wanted to experience something
mm.
different. And I felt that, I'd been burnt once by a UK broadcaster. So I wasn't going to get bitten twice. So there we go.
The grass is not necessarily greener,
Yes.
but it's just different grass.
Yeah, different grass.
A good friend of yours, Robert Minchell, who was living in Sydney at the time, invited you over on holiday in 2002 post your ITV experience. What struck you about Australia that enticed you to want to stay permanently when you eventually moved over? I know you saw the Opera House, the Blue Mountains. We
Yeah.
know it's hot. What was it about Australia, Simon?
Well, I'll be brutally honest. It wasn't really anything about Australia per se. It was more the fact, and when I came to see Rob, and Rob is the reason why I'm here, by the way. Rob was the guy who said there's a job going at SBS, you should apply for it, and pestered me and pestered me. But I was only here for 5 days in 2002. I'd actually been to the World Cup in Japan and Korea as a fan. I got tickets through the fan lottery or whatever they call it, along with a mate of mine, and I tagged 5 days on the end of my holiday to fly south to come and see Rob in Australia. So I was only here for maybe 5 or 6 days, so I didn't see an awful lot of Australia. That was the first time I'd ever been to Australia. Um, when the job offer came about in 2003, I think it was as much to do with the fact that I'd always wanted to sort of live abroad and experience a different lifestyle, a different country. And having turned down ESPN in Singapore only 12, 18 months prior, I think I'd sort of made myself a bit of a promise that if I ever got another opportunity to move overseas, come hell or high water, I would take it. So Australia was simply the first, uh, probably the only offer that I was going to get. So I didn't know anything about Australia really, other than those 5 days. Rob was the only person I knew in the country. Um, I read up on it, obviously, before I made the move. Found out about the relationship with football, which obviously was a little bit checkered. I read Johnny Warren's book, Sheila's Wogs and Pufters. I read Ross Solly's book called Shootout. If you've never read that, about the politics of football in Australia, goodness me, that was an interesting read. So it was less to do with, I want to live in Australia, and more to do with, here is an opportunity to do something that I'd always wanted to do, and that is live abroad. And like most expats, when I came over here in 2003, I thought it would be for 2-3 years, and that would be it. But things have a way of turning out differently, and obviously, my career went very well. So I'm still here all those years later. But I certainly don't regret it. It was a terrific move.
Thank God for that. Here's an interesting fact for you, Simon. There were 2 months and 16 days between you watching Manchester City lose 3-1 to Ipswich Town at Main Road for the first time with your father and the Socceroos drawing 0-0 with Chile at the Olympiastadion, West Berlin,
There you
at the
go.
74
You've
World
done your
Cup.
research. Very good.
Did you ever think that 31 years later, Sydney Olympic Park would draw you two together to form an unbreakable bond?
No. And I must be honest that I didn't watch the 74 World Cup, or if I did, I don't remember it. I was 5, 6 years of age then. And it's funny how, when you're that young as a kid, those few months make a difference. That first game that I went to watch in April 1974, I only found out it was against Ipswich and that we lost 3-1 years later. I have very little recollection of it, apart from the fact that I played with my toy cars on the wooden benches in the Platt Lane and Man City, which shows just how disinterested I must have been in the game. But in August 1974, which is only a few months after that, I do remember my dad saying, "Do you want to go to the game? City are playing West Ham, first home game of the season." I remember saying, "Yeah, absolutely." So that something must have changed in the interim. I had no idea what. And from that game forwards, I was hooked. So did I ever think Australia would? But no. I mean,
Of
to be
course,
honest, as I
yeah.
say, I had no concept of Australia. When I was a kid, apart from obviously knowing where it was and that it was a long way away from where I lived, and that we played them in cricket, every couple of years, and the Ashes was a great thing. But in terms of Australian football, I, probably the only ones that I would have known as a kid would have been John Cosmina because he came over and played for Arsenal very, very briefly. Obviously, later on, you got your Lucas Neals, your Mark Schwartzes, your Harry Kewells, your Tim Cahills, your Brett Emertons, the golden generation, and probably Craig Johnston before that, to be fair. But no, I was literally, starting from ground zero when I came to Australia in 2003. I knew very, very little, but I made it my business to find out. And I remember those first 12 months. I went all over Sydney. I watched Northern Spirit. They were sort of my team, if you like. Sydney United, Sydney Olympic, Parramatta Power, Marconi Stallions. I literally dipped myself into the local football culture and inhaled it basically and tried to find out because it fascinated me. I'm the same in every country I go to. I just love football. So and before you know it, yeah, I was very heavily involved in it, obviously.
Hmm. And people who are heavily involved in the history of the Socceroos can recount quite well the famous training camp in Mierlo in the south of Netherlands,
Mm,
in which Gus Hiddink proceeded to break each and every individual in that camp. Can you
he did.
describe some of Gus's favorite physical fitness drills during that time?
Oh, I don't know if I can remember the drills themselves. I do remember at the end of one training session in Mierlo, Mark Viduka just literally collapsing on his back and lying there for a good 5 or 10 minutes whilst everybody else went off and got their shower or started having their massage or whatever it was. He was absolutely cooked, and he wasn't the only one. And I remember at the time thinking, "Blimey, he's working them hard," because these were guys, coming off the back of full European seasons, most of them. So it's not that they were unfit; it wasn't pre-season for them, but it certainly felt like it. And obviously, what Huss was doing in his own way was getting them ready for the World Cup because he knew that Australia probably weren't going to be the best team at the World Cup in terms of their ability. So he was going to try and make them at least one of the fittest, so that they could, compete in the best possible way. And that's not to say that they didn't have any quality, because of course they did. That team. So yeah, he did. He flogged them pretty hard for that, was it a week or a fortnight? And we were there every day watching them, going, "Wow, this is brutal." But it worked, didn't it?
Mm. You recall some of those drills leading up to the Brazil game as well in regards to those
Yeah.
short-sighted games. That would have been remarkable. You got Cahill for Ducar. The names just roll off the tongue. Bresciano, the golden generation of technical skills in Australia, all combined in a small field. What a joy to watch that would have been.
Yeah, I mean, that was a fascinating insight into how Hiddink prepared tactically for a game against a team like Brazil, which is a match that has been, I think, largely forgotten by most Australians here because we lost that game. But I still remember it being the best performance that the Socceroos put in at that World Cup. And maybe part of the reason was the preparation was so intense for it. And just to elaborate on what you said there, Hiddink cut the pitch down to 30 metres, still with full size goals. So it was like the pitch had been squashed and played 11 against 11. And the mantra was, you've got to keep the ball for 10 seconds. And if you lost the ball before the 10-second, and obviously you can imagine with 22 players in that crowded space, it's damn difficult to keep hold of the ball for 10 seconds. But that was his mantra. And the reason why he was doing that, of course, is because he knew if they turned possession over to Brazil on a regular basis with their superior technique, they'd get smashed. So it was about ball retention for that specific game. And it very nearly worked. Although Australia lost the game 2-0, it could have so easily gone the other way.
They were such a humble group of players. I look back at some interviews over that time, listening to Lucas Neal, Bresciano, Cahill, how they spoke was just incredibly down to earth, and their ability to be able to soak like a sponge, really, everything that Hitting said. It was masterful, wasn't it? That combination.
They were, and look, that bunch of Socceroos obviously were very, very worldly, if that's the right term, because they all played in big European leagues. So this didn't phase them, but they were also very respectful of the opposition that they were facing, because they faced them on a weekly basis in the Premier League or La Liga or Serie A, wherever they played. So they knew what they were, coming up against, but they also knew their own quality, and they also believed in Hiddink. And I think Hiddink at that time was just the perfect coach for that Australian team, because it had all the raw ingredients. It just needed blending properly, and that's what Hiddink did. And the end result was obviously the best World Cup performance that we've ever seen from the Socceroos, and it's going to be tough to emulate that in future generations.
My last question in regards to the Socceroos in that time period was any vivid memories you have, Simon, from Bale Flores or Montevideo, Soy Celeste being an example of some of those experiences that you had. Was there any ones that clearly stand out?
At that World Cup, did you say? Or
In the experience of the following up, Montevideo, that kind of Soy
Hmm.
Celeste, the Uruguayan fans, and obviously Argentina beforehand. You spoke about Bale Flores, that kind of
Yeah,
area, the streets, the dogs, etc.
yeah. Again, look again. The preparation for the Uruguay away leg and the home leg. We know all about the chartered flights back to Australia, which gave the Socceroos the advantage. But again, what has not probably been spoken about too much is the preparation for the first leg. Now, in 2001, they'd flown straight to Montevideo and into the sort of the Bears pit of the Uruguayan fans. So they didn't make that mistake in 2005. They flew to Argentina, had a week-long camp in Buenos Aires, and they trained at the home of San Lorenzo, which was out in a district called Bayo Flores, which was not a particularly nice part of Buenos Aires, let me tell you. It was pretty, down at heel, and it was a rough area. And I think again that was all part of the prep to, maybe get the players ready for some of the sort of hostility they would encounter in Uruguay. But it was an intense week of training, and designed obviously to put them in the right time zone, to get their sleep patterns right, to get their meal times right, to get the feel of being in South America without actually having to experience any hostility, which there wasn't much, to be fair, anyway. In
Mm.
Uruguay, despite all the build up here, it was very tame. There was hostility on the day at the Estadio Centenario, which was absolutely brilliant. And you're right, that's still,
What
arguably
a
my
moment.
favorite
Oh,
experience ever, of them singing Soy Celeste, 50,000, 60,000, whatever it was, jumping up and down. The stadium literally shook and bounced, for 90 minutes. It was terrific, absolutely brilliant. Hostile, but in the right way. And that's what football should be. It should be a little bit edgy,
teetering on the brink. I love that,
teetering on the
Simon. I love
brink.
that. Um, Moving away from the Socceroos, more into the A League, talking about Australian fans, you did speak about the peak of the A League, which you said 4 or 5 years ago. Simon, I remember we're watching with my brother and my father Friday nights SBS, watching the first half, going outside on the driveway, kicking the ball, coming back in for the last 10 minutes, end to end action. You're right. That's when the A League was at its peak. So I won't ask you that, but I want to talk about the late Rebecca Wilson, who you've mentioned, who was an award-winning journalist for being a wonderful provocateur, fearless, intelligent, and passionate about both sports and the women's right to report on it. But I feel, in the Australian fans' football memory, she'll be known for her damning article in the Daily Telegraph calling for the exodus of active support in stadiums. The FFA, with incredible active supporter bases in the A-League, were then faced with a bizarre conundrum. How do you take that electricity, that liquid magic, and turn it into a lightning rod for the rest of the country, seemingly disinterested in the sport, without giving it the conditions to have the odd moron run amok? At the time, you were outraged by her comments. Was this a watershed moment in Australian football?
Um, well, look, yeah, I mean, I was outraged by the column, which I thought was unfair in terms of it being run on the front page, because really it was a fraction of the supporter base, a very small problem that became a huge issue. I was more frustrated, as a lot of journalists were, I certainly wasn't alone in this, by the response from the FFA at the time. Now, David Gallop called a press conference, I think it was for the Monday or the Tuesday, because obviously this became a huge issue over the weekend. And we all expected him. I mean, this was the equivalent of a free hit, a full toss that you whack over the boundary for a six. All he had to do really was defend the fans and say it's a small minority of people. This has been hugely blown out of all proportion. We'll take steps to deal with any troublemakers, but the vast majority of our fans are brilliant. That's all he had to say, and he didn't. I know I was staggered by it, and I wasn't alone. A lot of journalists, wrote articles on the back of that saying he's lost the fans, and he had, because again and this is when we talk about needing football people involved in positions of power. It's not about wearing a jersey and going, supporting a team on a Saturday. It's about the instinctive understanding of what a football fan thinks and feels. And at that moment, David, and I liked David, I still do, as a guy, but he didn't get it. He didn't understand how outraged football fans were by that article, and he responded in the wrong way. Now, the backlash against that press conference was so big that 2 days later, and people forget this, actually called another press conference where he went and did say the right thing, but it was too late. It was too late. That gut instinct for what football fans were feeling, and his responsibility, in my opinion, to represent them as the CEO of the FFA, he didn't quite get it. And that was a problem. And I think, we've struggled as a game largely ever since. It's not the only thing. It's not the only reason. There are lots of other reasons. But that was the lightning rod for that change, which is hugely unfortunate, because at that particular moment, the game was flying. That was late 2015. We were Asian champions. Our women's team had just got to the quarterfinals of the Women's World Cup. The A-League was on the up. Everything was in our favour. And really, we shot ourselves in the foot, not for the first time as a game, not for the
But
last
James
either.
Johnson gets it, doesn't he, Simon?
He does, yes. James is obviously an ex-player with Brisbane Strikers. He's been involved in football all his life, worked for FIFA, City Football Group, the Players Union here in Australia. So he's steeped in football DNA. He gets it instinctively. Unfortunately, he's picked up the reins on the back of 5 years of decline and largely neglect, particularly of the A-League, which is no longer his responsibility. Of course, it's on the clubs now. But James gets it, and I think he's so far done a pretty good job, to be honest. I mean, there's still an awful lot to do.
What a job! What a job, isn't it, Simon?
It's a thankless task. It's not a job I would have for quids.
Yes, I was just about to say that. I can understand, as much as the Australian people would probably vote you in 3 seconds, Simon. I can understand.
I don't think I'm qualified for that.
Yeah, well, there it is. Look, you've been quoted many times saying that football in Australia operates in silos. You've mentioned previously that we need to create a streamlined central body with state advisory boards or regional bureaus with professional management to implement central policy. Who would be involved, and how would that look in practice?
Blimey, I don't know who would be involved.
Even reading that out, Simon, I knew that was a tough one.
Yeah, I couldn't give you individual names, but I think the general principle is right. I think what we've seen in a lot of sports is that the federal or the federated model of governance is outdated. It's not necessarily fair in terms of representation. For example, Football New South Wales has, I don't know what the figure is, but a lot of registered players. So Football New South Wales registers an awful lot of people, whereas the ACT or Football Northern Territory represents a much smaller population. Yeah, up until very recently, they had the same vote. So that can be open to manipulation. I would like to see a much stronger head office, not necessarily dictating policy to the regions, and that's why we still need state advisory boards, because you need local input. You can't run affairs in Perth from Sydney, for example, because you're too far apart. But I think really head office needs to set policy and not have it challenged so often as it is at the moment. The game is too unwieldy. It's too ad hoc in terms of the way it's governed at the moment. Some of the layers of administration go off and do their own thing if they don't agree with head office. And the greatest example of this I can tell you is I wrote a story a few weeks ago for the Footyology website about some of the broken homes of football. I don't know if you read that. And one of the broken homes of football is the old St George Stadium in Sydney, which is a very famous venue, one of the traditional homes of the game. St George Budapest played there until they left the NSL. And over the last 15, 20 years, it's essentially been left to rack and ruin. It's a shell of a ground. The roof is now off the main stand. It's derelict. It's full of graffiti. The environs are full of weeds. It's a mess. And yet that should be one of our spiritual homes. And when I spoke to the guy who was the CEO of the local association there in St George, he said to me, look, one of the problems here is when we go to government to ask for money, be it state or federal, we go with 4 or 5 different hats on. So in the St George area, which is only a very small, part of Sydney, there are 4 NPL licensed teams. 4. St George City, St George Saints, I think it is, Hurstville Zagreb, and Rockdale Illingdon. So that's 4 in St George alone. He says when he goes to ask for money, he goes as the head of the St George FA. There are the 4 clubs who are all having a say. There's Football New South Wales, and on top of that, there's Football Australia. So government is getting 5 letters, whereas the AFL go with 1 and go, this is what we want. This is why we want it. Can you do it? There's no confusion as to what the sport is, who's asking for it, where it goes. We are all too fragmented, all working against each other because there are too many layers of administration, each with their own areas of responsibility and our own little fiefdoms in some ways. So I think we need to simplify that. And I'm not saying you get rid of every single layer of administration, because of course you need it in local areas. But, the central policy should be set by Football Australia, and the regions should be, by and large, with input and feedback, they should be carrying it out. What happens now is they go off and do their own thing, which creates confusion and a fractured sport.
And then that's what needs to change massively, and it needs to be said, it needs to be acknowledged first before change is to occur. But Simon, thank you very much on that. That is part 1 of a little bit of our series before we get into our next part. We'll be back shortly.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into Pros Around the World. I hope you're enjoying yourselves here. I just wanted to take the time to reach out to all aspiring professional footballers from around the world wanting to gain that extra advantage to their game through online fitness coaching. We offer all levels of packages to all level of footballers that come with full support, so your goals, and last but not least, having access to the Coastal Football Agency's network. So if you are looking to better yourself, broaden that network in your horizons to gain trials and opportunities, click the link in our bio or go to our website at www.coastalfootballfit.com. Cheers, guys.
Okay, welcome back to the Coastal Football Agency podcast, episode 4 with Simon Hill. And I've got a question here that I've wanted to ask Simon for about 6 months now in his fantastic podcast, Shim, Spider, and so much more, in which they always complain about the lack of money. Well, how about I give the money to Simon? Okay, you've been granted $2 billion to spend on football in Australia however you like. So the scenario would be, let's say you are in that position of power, CEO within Football Australia, who plan on injecting a $2 billion football stimulus package ahead of the 2022-23 A-League season and the Women's World Cup.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your generosity. That's absolutely terrific. Sadly, I fear it might be monopoly money, but we'll give it a go.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not going to go into breakdowns of different states. I think there are certainly some wish lists for the game that you could spend an awful lot of money in. First of all, I think stadium and facility building right around the country, and that's the same in New South Wales as it is up in Darwin and Perth and Launceston and Hobart. The game needs its own facilities, so I would be building stadiums as much as that money would allow in all the major hubs, and I'm talking about proper rectangular 15,000 seater, 20,000 seater stadiums that are not only for football but owned by football. So football gets all the revenue out of it. Training facilities, the same for both men and women, right around the country. That would be, I think, the biggest investment that football could have, and it would, obviously be there for the long term in perpetuity, for the game to own and make money out of, and refurbish as and when is necessary. I think as a secondary thing to that, I would certainly be spending an awful lot in terms of media coverage for the professional competitions and the NPL competitions as well. The game suffers from a lack of publicity, and that's because we don't have influence. Some of that is down to relationships. Some of it's down to money. So I would certainly be promoting the hell out of our competitions in a media sense and a marketing sense. I would also be setting up a national second division with, I don't know, 10, 12 clubs, whatever it is, with that war chest to be able to support them in those early years to make sure that they succeed and promote it. And get the right amount of publicity for it. And the last part of it would be on development in terms of coaching, in terms of youth. Put that money into good coaching for our young players, pathways for our young players. I mean, that would sort of come about because of the national second division and the increased publicity for the A and W League as well. But yeah, that's where the vast majority of my money would go. I reckon after building all those stadiums, I probably wouldn't have too much money left, to be fair. But anyway,
to put it in a little bit of perspective, I think Brisbane Roar were looking at a boutique stadium at around $60 million. Yeah. But if we look at Tottenham Hotspur's $1 billion stadium, which flips, you've seen it flips in itself, and it's remarkable.
Yeah, I mean that's that sort of stadium is probably bigger than the with respect the likes of Brisbane Roar need. They could have a 15,000 seater stadium somewhere in Brisbane, which would be perfectly adequate for them. You can always take grand finals to Suncorp, that's no problem. The bigger games, but for regular A-League season games, 15,000, 20,000 for all A-League clubs is more than big enough and would present the sort of atmosphere that our game thrives on by having the grounds looking full, feeling full, and most importantly, sounding full with the stands close to the pitch. That's what we need.
Beautiful. So we got an answer there. We got a national second division, stadiums, and coaching grassroots. Thank you very much, Simon. And the final question that I have, and this was for all the younger viewers out there and the younger audience, what is your final message to young aspiring football broadcasters in Australia?
Good luck. Given that there's not a lot of money or jobs available at the moment. No, in all seriousness, I just think, if you work hard, practice your craft, get as much experience as you possibly can, um, develop contacts, develop networks, then if you're good enough, at some point somebody will give you an opportunity. I can't offer any guarantees that anybody's going to be able to get into this industry, particularly these days, because there is not a lot of work around. The media is changing, and media networks are finding it difficult to pay their journalists because the audience is fragmented and the advertisers are fragmented. So it's not easy. But the flip side of that is the digital revolution is offering opportunities to get all sorts of experience, albeit maybe a lot of it unpaid. But you can, practice your skills, develop your craft, probably a lot easier than when I was, coming through the system. I was almost completely reliant on the mainstream media itself. So there's, swings and roundabouts, but work hard. Get as much experience as you can, develop your contacts, develop your networks, develop your own style. And if you're good enough, you'll get a chance. And then it's up to you to take it.
Thank you very much, Simon Hill, for your time today. And that was episode 4 of the Coastal Football Agency podcast, drawing to a conclusion. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Very much valued your time, Simon, and I look forward to potentially seeing you in the future and getting a signed copy of this book.
Happy to sign the book as and when we can meet up again post-COVID. Thanks, Daniel.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Simon. Bye.